The sky over the English Channel shimmered in the early morning light, a pale, deceptive calm stretched across the clouds, yet below it, a storm of fire, speed, and death was about to erupt. In the cockpit of a Boulton Paul Defiant, the aircrew felt the familiar shiver of anticipation, that premonition shared by all who soared into battle, that at any second the serene blue could be torn apart by the roaring engines of enemy fighters. On this particular day in the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe had unleashed a squadron of Bf-109s, confident in their superior speed, maneuverability, and firepower. They had no idea that the aircraft they deemed a slow, obsolete target would soon become a nightmare from the rear, delivered by men and machines underestimated in the annals of aerial combat. The Defiant was not designed to engage in dogfights. Its single-engine frame, devoid of forward-firing guns, seemed a sitting duck to the seasoned Luftwaffe pilots who had mastered their Messerschmitt's lethal agility. But it was precisely this unconventional design that would create moments of extraordinary audacity. The rear turret, a powered turret mounting 4.303 Browning machine guns, became the linchpin of what would soon be described by historians as one of the most audacious, high-risk air tactics of the early war period. The gunners of the Defiant were trained to operate under extreme pressure, firing in arcs that demanded split-second timing, spatial awareness, and an acceptance that a single miscalculation could be fatal. On this morning, the German fighters approached from above, banking into their attack formations with cold precision, confident in the mechanical and tactical advantages they carried. The Defiant flight, flying in tight formations over the channel, presented what appeared to be easy prey. As the first Bf-109 swooped down, the rear gunner rotated his turret smoothly, the whine of the motors competing with the staccato wind of the propellers. In that instant, a lethal rhythm began, a symphony of motion and fire, orchestrated by men who had trained their reflexes to anticipate every turn of an enemy aircraft, every evasive maneuver, every split second of exposure. The first 109 ignited under concentrated fire, a trail of smoke curling from its engine. The pilot attempted evasive action, but the angles from which the Defiant's gunners fired created zones of lethal coverage that the Luftwaffe pilots had not encountered in training. This was not luck, it was a calculated, almost mathematical application of defensive geometry. The gunners exploited the blind spots inherent in the Bf-109's approach vectors, turning the attacker's confidence into vulnerability. Within moments, another 109 followed, then another, each meeting a wall of synchronized bullets from the rear turret, as the Defiant pilots adjusted their headings, climbing and diving to place their gunners in positions of maximum effectiveness. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. Sweat-stung eyes, hands tightened on throttles, and every second stretched into an eternity. Yet the gunners remained composed, their training fused with instinct, their senses tuned to the smallest flicker of motion in the distance. They understood the stakes. A single lapse could result in immediate death. The Bf-109s, fast and agile, began to break their formations, scattering under the relentless fire. Observers on the ground would later recount the almost surreal sight of German aircraft seemingly exploding in midair, a cascade of black smoke and fragmented metal marking the precision of the Defiant's defensive assault. As the minutes ticked by, the Defiant gunners' discipline transformed panic into a deadly calculus. Pilots banked sharply to position their tail gunners, weaving through cloud banks and sun glare, each maneuver a delicate balance of aggression and caution. The Luftwaffe, initially confident in the superiority of their fighters, now found themselves ensnared in a deadly trap, one that exploited assumptions, miscalculations, and the audacity of a design and crew that refused to be pigeonholed by conventional tactics. The effect on air combat doctrine would be profound. Commanders began to reconsider the dynamics of escort formations, attack angles, and the underestimated potential of powered turrets in offensive-defensive roles. By the time the engagement had ended, several Bf-109s lay smoking in the air, victims not of speed or agility, but of timing, positioning, and a cold, precise application of firepower from a position thought to be weak. News of the engagement spread quickly, not through fanfare, but through the stark reports of commanding officers and intelligence officers, noting the unusual effectiveness of the Defiant gunners. The Luftwaffe pilots were forced to reassess their tactics, understanding that underestimating an enemy, even one seemingly outmatched, could lead to devastating losses. For the airmen of the Defiant, the victory was not just measured in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in survival, skill, and the quiet knowledge that they had rewritten a small but significant chapter of aerial warfare. Yet this moment, stunning as it was only the beginning. The Defiant's unusual victories highlighted the paradox of aerial combat. A machine designed for defense could, under the right conditions and under the guidance of disciplined, courageous men, achieve offensive outcomes that defied expectations. It was a stark lesson in adaptability, in the need to understand both one's own capabilities and the vulnerabilities of the enemy. In the skies over Europe, where every engagement could be fatal, such lessons were written in smoke, fire, and the precise trajectories of .303 caliber bullets. The legacy of the Defiant gunners' actions would echo beyond a single mission. Tactics evolved, not immediately, but inevitably, as commanders integrated the lessons of rear turret engagements into broader strategic thinking. Escort missions were redefined, fighter interception strategies recalibrated, and aircrew training increasingly emphasized the ability to exploit angles, anticipate enemy psychology, and leverage even apparently weak positions into formidable defensive advantages. The courage and precision of these gunners would become case studies in both Air Force training manuals and military history, illustrating how the audacity of individuals could alter the broader course of conflict, if only briefly, yet decisively. The Luftwaffe pilots, disciplined and well-trained, were suddenly confronted with an unexpected adversary. Each attack vector they attempted was met with precise, punishing fire from the Defiant's rear gunners. It was a psychological shock as much as a physical one. The pilots of the Bf-109s had spent months mastering dogfighting tactics, relying on speed, dive, and maneuver to outmatch what they assumed were inferior aircraft. Yet here in the summer skies over southern England, those tactics faltered against a machine and crew who had turned vulnerability into strength. The very audacity of the Defiant, a plane seemingly ill-equipped for air-to-air combat, forced the Luftwaffe into defensive maneuvers that were almost unthinkable for the aggressor. Inside the Defiant's cockpit, the crew operated as a single organism. The pilot's role shifted from attacker to facilitator, constantly adjusting the aircraft's orientation to give the gunners optimal angles. The navigator monitored enemy positions, providing verbal cues that synchronized with the gunner's instincts. In these fleeting high-speed moments, communication was compressed into almost imperceptible signals: a nod, a throttle adjustment, a subtle bank of the plane. The gunners, meanwhile, managed the delicate mechanics of their powered turret, rotating and elevating the guns to track targets moving unpredictably at hundreds of miles per hour. Every trigger pull, every burst of fire was calculated, balancing the desire to destroy with the necessity of conserving ammunition and avoiding overexposure to enemy fire. As the engagement intensified, the air was filled with the roar of engines and the rattle of gunfire, punctuated by the distant crackle of tracer rounds slicing through the sky. The Bf-109s attempted coordinated maneuvers, diving in from the sun, looping behind cloud cover, trying to split the Defiant formation. But the rear gunners anticipated the angles. Their fire created overlapping fields of coverage, forcing attackers into zones of maximum vulnerability. One by one, the Messerschmitts were forced to break away, engines smoking, wings damaged, or spiraling uncontrollably toward the channel below. Observers would later describe the scene as almost choreographed, a deadly ballet of metal, fire, and human skill, with each Defiant crew member executing movements with near-perfect timing under unimaginable stress. The tactical brilliance of the Defiant lay not merely in the mechanics of firing, but in the psychology of engagement. The Luftwaffe pilots had been trained to perceive a certain type of threat in a given formation, and the Defiant inverted those expectations. The rear gunners capitalized on predictability, luring the enemy into zones where their confidence became a liability. This exploitation of expectation, combined with mechanical ingenuity, demonstrated a principle that would influence air combat for years to come. Sometimes, the most effective offensive is found within an apparent defensive weakness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours for both sides. The sky, once a passive expanse, had become an arena of concentrated danger. Every motion, every sound, every flicker of light from a distant wing demanded attention. The Defiant crews were acutely aware that any miscalculation could be fatal. The German fighters equally were adjusting on the fly, attempting to regain momentum to strike a decisive blow. The interplay between attack and counterattack created a tension that was almost unbearable, a high-stakes chess game played at hundreds of miles per hour, where the smallest error could mean death. Amid the chaos, the rear gunners demonstrated a remarkable blend of composure and aggression. Their training emphasized rapid target acquisition, disciplined bursts of fire, and anticipation of enemy maneuvers. They rotated the turret continuously, tracking multiple aircraft at once, adjusting for speed, angle, and distance. Each shot required judgment. Too early and the enemy could escape, too late and the target might fire first. The Defiant's success was not accidental. It was the result of meticulous preparation, the hard-earned instincts of men who had flown countless missions, and an understanding that in war, daring tactics often intersected with extreme danger. As the engagement reached its climax, the Luftwaffe pilots found themselves disoriented and increasingly hesitant. The aerial confidence that had defined their early sorties over Britain was eroding under the relentless, precise, and unconventional fire of the Defiant gunners. They began to overcompensate, breaking formation, attempting desperate dives or evasive loops, often into the very zones where the rear gunners were ready to strike. Each successful defense reinforced the psychological dominance of the Defiant crews, proving that skill, positioning, and audacity could offset technological disadvantages. The wider implications of these encounters were profound. RAF intelligence and command structures took note of the repeated successes of the Defiant's rear gunners, understanding that certain engagements required innovation over brute force. These lessons would shape training, tactics, and operational planning, highlighting the importance of crew coordination, turret optimization, and the strategic exploitation of perceived weaknesses. In essence, a single aircraft's unusual design and the courage of its crew forced a reevaluation of what constituted offensive and defensive capability in air combat. By the time the dogfight subsided, the results were unmistakable. Several Bf-109s had been neutralized, their losses disproportionate to the Defiant's limited forward firepower. The sky was littered with trails of smoke and the distant echoes of engines fleeing back to continental airfields. For the crews of the Defiant, the victory was both thrilling and sobering. The cost of aerial war was never measured merely in enemy kills, but in the thin margin between life and death, the fragility of human effort amidst metal, fire, and velocity. Yet beyond the immediate tactical success lay the enduring lesson. War rewards those who can perceive opportunity where others see only weakness. The Defiant, once dismissed as a slow, defenseless craft, became a symbol of ingenuity and courage. Its gunners' daring maneuvers challenged the assumptions of both friend and foe, leaving an indelible mark on the evolution of aerial warfare. And in the quiet moments after the engagement, as crews returned to base, their adrenaline still high and the sky now calm, they understood that they had participated in something larger, a turning point in the understanding of combat dynamics, where the audacity of a few could rewrite the rules of the many. The human element of aerial combat is often overshadowed by machines and tactics, yet in the Defiant, it was the human will that defined the outcome. Behind every calculated turret rotation and every precise burst of .303 fire was a crew grappling with fear, fatigue, and the constant awareness that one misjudged move could be fatal. In the tight confines of the cockpit, heat and noise became physical barriers, yet the gunners maintained an almost unnatural calm, their minds sharpening with each second of exposure. The rhythm of battle, the staccato of tracer rounds, the roar of engines, the wind slicing past the fuselage became a guide, a dangerous metronome that dictated split-second choices. The psychological strain was immense. Luftwaffe attacks came in waves, each more aggressive than the last, forcing Defiant pilots to make instantaneous calculations. When to climb, when to dive, how to maneuver without exposing the aircraft to a fatal firing angle. Gunners, in turn, had to track multiple fast-moving targets while avoiding return fire. The rear turret, once considered a defensive liability, now became a focal point of lethal opportunity. Its rotation, speed, and firepower allowed the gunners to cover blind spots, turning the aircraft into a moving fortress capable of punishing even the most experienced fighter pilots. In these moments, training and instinct intertwined. Every pilot and gunner had drilled for emergencies, but nothing could fully prepare them for the intensity of combat at close range. The sky itself seemed alive, a canvas of smoke, metal, and fire, each movement unpredictable, each decision potentially decisive. The Luftwaffe pilots, by contrast, faced frustration and disorientation. Their usual superiority, speed, maneuverability, and numerical advantage was undermined by the Defiant's unconventional defensive tactics. They had underestimated the aircraft, and in the calculus of war, that mistake proved costly. The Defiant's rear gunners did not operate in isolation. Communication between pilot and gunner was fluid, almost instinctive. Subtle adjustments to speed or altitude synchronized with turret rotation, allowing gunners to anticipate enemy approaches rather than react. When a Bf-109 dove from the sun, the turret was already tracking, aligning a deadly corridor of fire that the attacking pilot could not evade. The aircraft itself, once derided as vulnerable, became an extension of the gunner's skill, a tool that transformed fear into control, panic into precision. The intensity of these encounters also had immediate implications for RAF operations. Intelligence officers meticulously debriefed each sortie, recording details of angles, engagement distances, and enemy behavior. The lessons gleaned from these reports informed squadron tactics. Formation flying was adjusted to optimize rear gunner effectiveness, interception patterns were modified, and pilot-gunner coordination became central to mission planning. The Defiant, initially an experiment in aircraft design, had forced a strategic reconsideration of how defensive technology could be employed offensively. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe faced its own learning curve. Pilots returned to base with reports of unexpected resistance, detailing the devastating effectiveness of the rear gunners. Commanders in Berlin analyzed the encounters, noting that their traditional attack formations were vulnerable to well-trained turret fire. Tactics evolved quickly. High-speed slashing attacks replaced coordinated dives, altitudes were adjusted to minimize exposure, and pilots were warned to avoid prolonged head-on or tail approaches without escort support. The psychological impact was as significant as the material losses. Pilots who had flown over France with confidence now approached engagements over Britain with heightened caution. Amid this strategic evolution, individual heroism stood out. The Defiant gunners' composure under fire became legendary, not in propaganda, but in the measured reports of their peers and commanding officers. They demonstrated that courage, skill, and adaptability could transform a plane initially judged inferior into a deadly instrument. The notion of a suicidal tactic was reframed. What appeared reckless was in fact an extraordinary application of tactical understanding. The gunners' willingness to operate in exposed positions, to maintain fire under extreme stress, challenged conventional thinking about what constituted viable engagement strategy in aerial warfare. In the aftermath of each sortie, the physical and emotional toll was evident. Crews returned with cuts, bruises, and the lingering echo of adrenaline. Yet the sense of accomplishment was palpable. They had survived, yes, but they had also proven the validity of a concept that would influence subsequent RAF doctrine. Their experiences were documented, analyzed, and shared, becoming part of a living repository of knowledge that informed training and operational decisions across squadrons. Each mission, each engagement, reinforced the principle that innovation and audacity could offset technological or numerical disadvantage, a lesson that would resonate throughout the remainder of the war. The broader strategic implications of these engagements were profound. While the Defiant could not match the sheer speed and versatility of the Bf-109, its gunners demonstrated that carefully executed tactics could yield disproportionate results. Luftwaffe leadership was forced to reconsider assumptions about air superiority. RAF planners, in turn, integrated rear turret offensive techniques into wider operational thinking, experimenting with coordinated flights that maximized defensive firepower while minimizing exposure. In this sense, the Defiant's early victories were not just tactical triumphs, they were a catalyst for doctrinal innovation, forcing both sides to adapt, anticipate, and evolve. As the war continued, the shadow of these engagements lingered. Pilots carried the memory of the deadly precision of the Defiant gunners, a constant reminder that the skies over Europe were unpredictable and unforgiving. Rear gunner tactics became a case study, not merely of mechanical ingenuity, but of the human capacity to convert fear into disciplined action, vulnerability into advantage. It was a lesson writ large in smoke trails and spent shell casings, in the quiet reports filed by crews who had survived by their skill, courage, and unflinching adherence to training under fire. The rear turret of the Boulton Paul Defiant was, in many ways, the unsung hero of these aerial duels. A fully powered, electrically driven mechanism mounting 4.303 Browning machine guns, it was deceptively simple in concept yet extraordinarily demanding in practice. The gunners had to manage multiple variables simultaneously: speed and trajectory of approaching aircraft, angle of attack, distance, wind, and even the subtle yawing motions of their own aircraft. The turret's rotation and elevation controls required precision, as any misalignment could allow an enemy fighter to slip through the kill zone unscathed. Yet in the hands of trained men, it became a deadly weapon, capable of punishing mistakes that a conventional forward-firing armament could not reach. The geometry of fire was a science as much as an art. Defiant crews discovered that by coordinating maneuvers, they could create overlapping fields of fire, forcing Bf-109s into trajectories where evasion was nearly impossible. A head-on dive from one German fighter might be countered by a subtle climb and yaw from the pilot, while the turret gunner aimed slightly ahead of the expected path, allowing for lead correction. Simultaneously, another approaching aircraft could be engaged by adjusting the angle of elevation. Within seconds, multiple attackers could be neutralized, not by luck, but by the disciplined execution of lethal mathematics in motion. It was a system that demanded trust in the aircraft, trust in the crew, and trust in one's own instincts honed through countless hours of simulation and practice. The Luftwaffe, initially bemused by the Defiant's unusual configuration, quickly recognized the threat it posed when handled effectively. Reports from downed or damaged pilots described a terrifying phenomenon. A plane that seemed stationary in its vulnerability could, in the hands of a coordinated crew, unleash torrents of fire that shattered formations, destroyed engines, and forced evasive maneuvers that often led to collisions or fatal miscalculations. What the German pilots had dismissed as a slow, defenseless bomber with a rear turret had become, in practice, a surgical instrument of death. The psychological impact was profound. Pilots began to hesitate, to second-guess their attack angles, and to overcompensate, providing the Defiant crews with critical openings. Within the cockpit, coordination between pilot and gunner reached a level that approached instinct. A subtle bank to the left, a slight increase in throttle, a minor adjustment in altitude, all became part of an intricate choreography designed to maximize turret effectiveness while minimizing exposure. The gunner's role was dynamic, requiring constant anticipation of enemy movement, rapid assessment of lead angles, and disciplined trigger discipline. Unlike conventional dogfighting, where agility and speed dictated outcomes, the Defiant relied on a synergistic relationship between pilot and gunner, a shared understanding that every movement of the aircraft directly influenced the effectiveness of defensive fire. As the engagement progressed, the Luftwaffe pilots attempted increasingly complex maneuvers, diving from altitude, banking sharply to avoid tracer fire, even approaching from unexpected angles. Yet the Defiant crews adapted in real time. Cloud cover was used strategically, not just for concealment, but as a means to control engagement timing. Sun angles were exploited to obscure the position of the turret until the moment of firing. Every choice was calculated to create maximum vulnerability for the enemy while preserving the aircraft and crew. The result was a series of engagements where the Defiant, despite its slower speed and lack of forward armament, achieved disproportionate success in downing enemy fighters. The human cost, however, remained high. Each encounter tested physical endurance, mental resilience, and nerve. Turbulence, engine vibrations, and the constant threat of enemy fire imposed immense strain. The gunner's eyes had to constantly adjust to shifting light and shadow, to the glint of enemy aircraft, and to the erratic movements of pilots under duress. The smallest lapse, a delayed rotation of the turret, a momentary miscalculation in lead, could prove fatal. Yet it was precisely this acceptance of risk, this willingness to operate on the edge of survival, that enabled the Defiant to achieve feats that conventional tactics deemed improbable, if not impossible. Reports from these engagements filtered through RAF intelligence networks, prompting doctrinal reconsideration. Rear gunners were increasingly integrated into mission planning, with emphasis on positioning and timing designed to exploit known enemy vulnerabilities. Training programs evolved, emphasizing not just marksmanship but spatial awareness, anticipation of enemy psychology, and seamless coordination between pilot and gunner. The Defiant, once an experimental aircraft, became a living laboratory for tactical innovation. Every sortie contributed to a growing repository of knowledge that would influence air strategy for the remainder of the European campaign. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's response was telling. Pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged engagements from the rear, to vary attack altitudes, and to employ high-speed slashing attacks rather than coordinated dives. Commanders analyzed patterns of Defiant victories, noting the effectiveness of turret coverage and the importance of predicting aircraft maneuvers. The psychological lesson was as significant as the material one. Underestimating the capabilities of a so-called inferior aircraft could yield catastrophic losses, and adaptation was as critical to survival as skill in the cockpit. By the end of these missions, the Defiant crews had not only survived, but had altered the tactical landscape. Their successes were measured not merely in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in the lasting influence on air combat doctrine. The very concept of what constituted offensive capability was challenged. Rear gunners, once considered ancillary, were now central to mission planning, and aircraft design philosophy began to accommodate the lessons of these engagements. The courage, precision, and ingenuity of the Defiant crews had forced a reevaluation of the assumptions that guided aerial warfare, demonstrating that under certain conditions, audacity could compensate for apparent deficiency. The days that followed these early encounters saw the Defiant's crews increasingly tested, their skills honed under the unforgiving scrutiny of combat. Luftwaffe pilots, now aware of the deadly potential of the rear turret, adjusted their tactics, attempting more aggressive, less predictable maneuvers. Yet the Defiant crews adapted with remarkable speed. Each sortie became a dynamic interplay of anticipation and reaction, a game of aerial chess where one misstep could be fatal, and one precise maneuver could decide the fate of multiple aircraft. The tension in the cockpit was relentless. Every bank, every dive, every roll was performed with the knowledge that the slightest error could mean death, not just for oneself, but for the entire formation. Engagements escalated in complexity. BF-109s approached in waves, attacking from sun angles, cloud cover, and unexpected vectors. Yet the Defiant crews, drawing on experience, coordinated their responses with uncanny precision. The pilots' adjustments to altitude and heading were matched by the turret gunners' rotations and bursts, creating lethal zones that enveloped the attackers. Observers would later marvel at the effectiveness of this coordination. Aircraft that should have easily outmaneuvered the Defiant were instead destroyed or forced to retreat, victims of a combination of human skill, mechanical ingenuity, and audacious tactics. The geometry of the engagements became increasingly sophisticated. Gunners learned to exploit predictable enemy flight paths, adjusting for closure rates, target angles, and relative motion. In some cases, a single well-timed burst could take out two aircraft, as one enemy pilot collided with another in the confusion of evasive maneuvers. The Defiant's design, initially criticized for its lack of forward armament, became a lesson in maximizing defensive strength to achieve offensive results. It was a paradox of war. The aircraft that seemed weakest in theory could be most lethal when wielded with precision and courage. The human factor remained paramount. Crews experienced the extremes of physical and psychological stress. Noise, vibration, and the constant threat of death pushed every nerve to its limit, yet the adrenaline-fueled focus allowed them to perform at levels beyond ordinary human expectation. The gunners' eyes tracked multiple targets simultaneously. Their fingers operated the turret with exacting discipline. Their minds anticipated enemy reactions before they occurred. In these moments, fear was not eliminated, but transformed into a sharp, heightened awareness that allowed for decisive action under pressure. The Luftwaffe, frustrated and alarmed, adjusted once more. Pilots began coordinating attacks with fighter escorts, attempting to draw the Defiant into prolonged engagements where its slower speed could be exploited. Yet even under these conditions, the rear gunners demonstrated remarkable adaptability. They coordinated fire to cover both defensive and offensive needs, creating overlapping zones of protection that made it nearly impossible for enemy pilots to find safe vectors. Each engagement became a testament to the importance of coordination, anticipation, and disciplined execution in modern air combat. The strategic implications of these engagements were not lost on higher command. RAF intelligence recognized that the Defiant's rear gunners had introduced a new variable into the aerial battlefield, one that required a reevaluation of both aircraft design and tactical doctrine. Training programs were revised to emphasize not just piloting skill but crew coordination, turret efficiency, and the anticipation of enemy maneuvers. The lessons learned extended beyond the immediate theater. They influenced broader RAF strategy, informing decisions about aircraft deployment, formation flying, and engagement protocols for the remainder of the European conflict. Despite the success, the human cost was ever present. Each mission carried the possibility of fatal miscalculation. Turrets jammed, engines faltered, and enemy fire could strike with lethal accuracy in an instant. Crews returned to base exhausted, their senses still attuned to the rhythm of battle, their adrenaline slowly ebbing but their minds already analyzing what had worked and what had not. In these debriefs, both successes and failures were scrutinized, creating a continuous cycle of learning and adaptation that would prove invaluable in the months to come. As the weeks passed, the Defiant's reputation grew. Enemy pilots recounted the terrifying efficiency of its gunners, while RAF crews shared lessons learned, refining tactics and improving coordination. What had once been considered an underperforming aircraft had, through human ingenuity and courageous execution, become a symbol of adaptability and tactical innovation. The rear turret, previously underestimated, had reshaped the understanding of how aircraft could be used in defensive and offensive roles alike. Through these engagements, the air war over Britain was irrevocably changed. The Defiant, flying missions that demanded extreme precision and courage, demonstrated that even perceived vulnerabilities could be transformed into extraordinary advantages. The lessons extended beyond the immediate conflict, influencing training, aircraft design, and tactical doctrine across the Allied forces. Crews who survived these battles carried with them not only the memory of destruction wrought, but also the proof that courage, coordination, and innovation could alter the calculus of war in profound and lasting ways. Despite the Defiant's remarkable successes, the Luftwaffe was relentless in its adaptation. German commanders, analyzing reports and debriefs, quickly understood that frontal assaults were suicidal against well-coordinated Defiant crews. They implemented new tactics, high-speed slashing attacks, multiple plane pincer maneuvers, and concentrated group formations intended to overwhelm a single aircraft's defensive arcs. In response, the RAF crews of the Defiant found themselves in an ever-evolving contest of wit, reflex, and nerve. Each engagement demanded split-second judgment, the kind that blurred the line between calculated strategy and instinctive survival. The cockpit became both sanctuary and trap. Pilots had to maintain speed and positioning while coordinating with rear gunners, whose very existence now dictated the enemy's every maneuver. The gunners themselves faced unimaginable pressures, operating machinery that required constant adjustments, their eyes trained to detect subtle shifts in enemy approach, their fingers poised over triggers ready to unleash deadly fire. Even the slightest miscalculation, a delayed rotation, a momentary hesitation, could result in disaster. Yet the crews had become symbiotic, aircraft and humans merged into a single fighting entity, each movement designed to maximize lethal potential while navigating the razor-thin margin between life and death. One notable engagement illustrated the growing tactical sophistication. A squadron of Bf-109s, seeking to exploit the Defiant's slower speed, approached from multiple vectors, coordinating dives and banking maneuvers in an attempt to split the formation. The Defiant pilots, anticipating the assault, maneuvered their aircraft into positions that funneled the attackers into overlapping zones of fire. Turrets rotated bursts of .303 ammunition tore through the air, and enemy aircraft were forced into evasive paths that frequently intersected with one another. In the space of minutes, several Bf-109s were damaged or destroyed, a testament to the deadly calculus of angles, timing, and anticipation. These encounters highlighted a stark truth. In air combat, innovation could temporarily negate technological superiority. The Defiant, initially derided for its lack of forward armament, became a masterclass in defensive ingenuity. Turret gunners, once peripheral, assumed central importance, demonstrating that effective coordination and audacity could achieve outcomes that raw performance metrics alone might deem impossible. The RAF's investment in training, in crew cohesion, and in rapid tactical adaptation proved decisive, allowing these aircraft to punch above their weight, at least in the early phase of their deployment. Yet the war was relentless and adaptation was constant. Luftwaffe pilots, learning from repeated engagements, developed increasingly sophisticated countertactics. High-speed attacks from multiple angles, coordinated escorts, and concentrated firepower gradually reduced the Defiant's survivability. Pilots who had initially underestimated the aircraft learned to approach with caution, employing evasive timing and indirect attack vectors that exploited the Defiant's slower maneuvering. Losses mounted and the once feared rear turret became less impenetrable. The era of Defiant dominance was brief, yet its impact was enduring. The legacy of the Defiant gunners' tactics extended far beyond immediate victories. RAF doctrine evolved to emphasize the integration of defensive and offensive strategies in all aircraft design. Turret coordination became central to bomber escort missions, and the lessons learned from these engagements informed the development of multi-gunner aircraft such as the Lancaster and the Wellington. The principle was clear: human skill, when combined with mechanical innovation, could transform apparent weakness into lethal strength. This lesson echoed through the RAF's operational planning for the remainder of the European campaign, shaping both strategy and training. On a human level, the experiences left an indelible mark. Crews returned with scars visible and invisible, the physical toll of combat and the psychological imprint of high-stakes survival. Yet with each sortie, confidence, skill, and teamwork deepened. The terror of the first encounters gave way to disciplined execution, a shared understanding that success depended on precise coordination, rapid adaptation, and the courage to operate at the edge of human limits. Each engagement became a study in risk management, anticipation, and the raw power of coordinated human endeavor in a theater dominated by machines and speed. By the time the Defiant's role shifted away from daylight operations, its story was already cemented in the chronicles of aerial warfare. The aircraft had demonstrated that tactical ingenuity could achieve results disproportionate to raw performance, that audacity could disrupt established doctrines, and that human skill could convert vulnerability into advantage. Pilots and gunners had rewritten the rules, leaving a legacy that would inform not just RAF operations, but the broader understanding of air combat strategy for decades to come. Even as technology advanced, the lessons of the Defiant endured. Rear gunner coordination, defensive-offensive integration, and the calculated exploitation of enemy assumptions became fundamental principles in aerial tactics. The audacity of these crews proved that war is not merely a contest of machines, but of minds, anticipation, and the courage to act decisively under extreme pressure. Their story remains a testament to how ingenuity, skill, and human resolve can transform even the most unlikely of tools into instruments of strategic influence. The final chapter of the Defiant's operational story is not written in victories or losses alone, but in the transformation it inspired across the air war. By the end of 1941, daylight operations for the Defiant had largely ceased, its vulnerabilities increasingly exposed to a Luftwaffe now well acquainted with its strengths and weaknesses. Yet the influence of its rear gunner tactics resonated far beyond the aircraft's own operational lifespan. Crews who had flown these missions became instructors, training new generations of pilots and gunners in the art of coordination, anticipation, and audacity. The psychological lessons, how to convert fear into focus, vulnerability into leverage, were codified alongside technical training, ensuring that the knowledge gained would outlive the aircraft itself. RAF planners incorporated these insights into strategic doctrine. Bomber escorts were arranged to maximize defensive coverage, fighter tactics evolved to emphasize multi-angle coordination, and the concept of turning a defensive position into an offensive advantage became a central tenet of air strategy. The Defiant's engagements demonstrated that success in aerial warfare was not dictated solely by speed, maneuverability, or firepower, but by the integration of human skill, aircraft capability, and tactical ingenuity. Pilots and gunners who had survived these encounters carried with them an experiential understanding of angles, timing, and coordination that would inform the Allied approach in subsequent theaters of war. The Luftwaffe in turn adjusted. Reports from German pilots chronicled the terror of the rear turret, the frustration of repeated failed attacks, and the recalibration of assumptions regarding enemy capabilities. Commanders emphasized flexible tactics, formation discipline, and evasive training, all lessons learned in response to the Defiant's unconventional threat. What had begun as isolated engagements over southern England catalyzed a broader reevaluation of air combat principles, illustrating how a single aircraft type, in the hands of skilled and courageous crews, could exert influence far beyond its numbers. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Defiant lies in its testament to human adaptability. Pilots and gunners alike demonstrated that training, anticipation, and the courage to act decisively under extreme risk could reshape the battlefield. The psychological dimension of aerial combat, fear, hesitation, and the power of expectation, proved as consequential as any technological advantage. Enemy pilots learned caution, RAF crews learned confidence, commanders learned to rethink conventional wisdom. Each sortie, each engagement became a microcosm of innovation under fire, a crucible in which human ingenuity transformed the potential for disaster into a calculated and effective response. Even in decline, the Defiant left a profound legacy. Its lessons informed the design and deployment of later multi-gunner aircraft, influenced escort and interception tactics, and provided case studies in operational adaptability. Rear gunners, once considered secondary, gained recognition as essential elements of aerial strategy, their training and coordination integrated into the broader doctrine of the RAF. The impact of these engagements endured, shaping Allied air operations through the remainder of the European campaign, and influencing post-war thinking about the interplay between aircraft design, human skill, and tactical innovation. In reflecting on the Defiant and its crews, one sees not just a story of survival or victory, but a demonstration of how daring, ingenuity, and disciplined execution can redefine the possibilities of warfare. A plane initially dismissed as obsolete became, through courage and tactical innovation, a symbol of adaptation and resourcefulness. Its story reminds us that in war, as in life, the perceived weak can, under the guidance of skill and courage, become decisive. The audacity of the Defiant gunners, operating under constant threat, turned moments of vulnerability into extraordinary triumphs, leaving an enduring mark on the history of aerial combat. As history would record, the Boulton Paul Defiant's place in World War II is not measured simply by its kill count, but by the influence it exerted on tactics, doctrine, and human understanding of aerial engagement. Rear gunners proved that meticulous preparation, acute anticipation, and the courage to operate on the edge of survival could yield results that challenged assumptions, disrupted enemy plans, and reshaped doctrine. Though the aircraft itself eventually ceded dominance to faster, more versatile fighters, the principles demonstrated by its crews continued to resonate, influencing the design of aircraft, training of gunners, and execution of missions for the remainder of the war. In the end, the legacy of the Defiant gunners endures as a lesson in courage, ingenuity, and adaptability. They transformed a perceived weakness into a decisive tactical advantage, reshaping air combat forever. Their story illustrates the eternal truth of warfare. Human skill, applied with precision, discipline, and daring, can alter outcomes far beyond what machines alone might dictate. It is a story of audacity under fire, of men confronting overwhelming odds with intelligence and courage, and of an aircraft that, for a fleeting moment, rewrote the rules of aerial engagement in the skies over Europe.